By early 1945, World War II had reached its final, brutal stage. Germany, once the most powerful nation in Europe, was collapsing. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army advanced steadily. After massive battles in Poland and Hungary, Soviet forces were now approaching Germany's borders. Cities that had once stood as symbols of power were now in ruins. Moscow had directed a full-scale push toward Berlin, aiming to end the war before the Western Allies could strike deep into Germany. The German army was weak and divided. On paper, it still had millions of men, but many were young boys or old men, barely trained, poorly equipped, and exhausted from years of fighting. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. Tanks were often left in open fields, abandoned without repair. German cities had been bombed for years, and industry was crippled. Factories could not produce enough weapons. Supplies were falling behind the front lines, and morale was collapsing. Hitler, still in his bunker in Berlin, refused to leave. He ordered defenses to hold at all costs. He believed that Berlin could not fall while he remained in the city. High-ranking generals disagreed, warning that the city was indefensible. They pleaded for retreat or surrender to save civilians and soldiers, but Hitler refused. Propaganda broadcast over radios kept telling the people that victory was possible, though everyone in Berlin knew the truth. The Red Army was coming, and the end was near. The Soviets had planned the attack carefully. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the 1st Belarusian Front, while Marshal Ivan Konyev led the 1st Ukrainian Front. Together, they had nearly 2 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. They had learned from previous battles in Poland and had prepared for urban warfare, knowing that street-to-street fighting would be intense and deadly. Berlin itself was strategically critical. It was the political heart of Germany and symbolically the center of the Nazi regime. Capturing Berlin would not only end the war in Europe, but also crush the morale of the German population and military. The city was heavily defended, with barricades, trenches, and fortified buildings. Every street corner, subway station, and apartment block could become a deadly trap. The civilian population was caught in the middle. Millions of men, women, and children had nowhere to go. Some tried to flee west, hoping to reach the Allied lines, but the roads were filled with refugees, German soldiers, and abandoned vehicles. Food was scarce. Water was limited. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The city was preparing for a siege, though most civilians had no clear understanding of how bad it would become. As the Soviets closed in, fear and desperation filled Berlin. Air raid sirens had become a daily, even hourly, sound. Smoke from burning buildings hung over the streets, mixing with the ash of destroyed homes. Children clung to their mothers. Elderly residents shuffled through debris, seeking shelter. Soldiers tried to keep order, but chaos was growing. Every sound of artillery or tank fire sent people diving for cover. The fall of Berlin was more than a military operation. It was the final chapter of a war that had killed tens of millions across Europe. Political leaders, soldiers, and civilians all faced the same grim reality. The city would be destroyed, and the human cost would be enormous. Yet in this chaos, planning, strategy, and decisions by both sides continued to shape what would happen in the coming days. Every corner of Berlin held a story. Factories turned into defensive bunkers. Schools and hospitals became temporary shelters for soldiers and civilians alike. Streets, once bustling with life, were empty or filled with rubble. Smoke rose from hundreds of fires, creating a thick haze that blurred the line between the living and the destruction around them. The Red Army was on the march, and nothing could stop the coming storm. The stage was set. 2 massive armies, millions of men, tanks, artillery, and aircraft, were about to clash in a city that had already suffered greatly. Berlin's fall would not come quietly. It would be brutal. It would be chaotic. It would leave scars that the city and the world would remember for decades. As April 1945 progressed, Berlin's defenses were hastily organized. General Helmuth Weidling was appointed commander of the city's garrison. He inherited a mixture of exhausted German troops, poorly trained Hitler Youth, and remaining SS units. Many soldiers had little combat experience. They were given rifles, machine guns, and a few tanks, but ammunition was limited. The city's fortifications were improvised, barricades on streets, mines in rubble, and fortified buildings. Every block became a potential battlefield. Hitler's bunker, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, had become the nerve center of the city. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, worked tirelessly to keep morale alive. Radio broadcasts promised heroic resistance and assured the population that victory was still possible. But these messages clashed with the harsh reality. Soviet artillery could already be heard from the outskirts, and the city was surrounded on multiple sides. The German High Command knew that time was running out. The Soviets approached with precision. Marshal Zhukov commanded the northern and central sectors, while Marshal Konyev moved from the south. They had prepared for urban combat, using lessons from Stalingrad and Warsaw. Soviet forces included elite infantry, experienced tank brigades, artillery, and air support. Their goal was simple: take Berlin quickly to end the war. But they also knew that street-to-street fighting in a heavily defended city would be deadly. Berlin's population of roughly 2 million people faced unimaginable danger. Bombing raids had destroyed much of the city's infrastructure. Food and water were scarce. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Thousands of civilians had fled, but many remained, trapped by blocked roads or unable to travel. Families huddled in basements, cellars, or underground stations. The sounds of approaching artillery and marching soldiers filled the streets. Fear was constant. The German army's defensive strategy relied on the city's layout. Narrow streets, dense buildings, and rubble-filled avenues could slow the Soviet advance. Snipers occupied upper floors of apartment buildings. Machine gun nests were set in stairwells and basements. Armored cars and the few remaining tanks were stationed at key intersections. Despite these preparations, German forces were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Politically, Hitler insisted on total defense. He ordered that Berlin must not fall, even at the cost of civilians' lives. He believed that surrender would bring dishonor and that holding the city would prove Germany's strength. Many German officers recognized the futility of this approach, but were forced to obey. Tension grew between military leaders who wanted to preserve life and Hitler, who demanded destruction and resistance. Soviet planners also faced challenges. Urban warfare is slow and dangerous. Tanks could not move freely through narrow streets. Mines, barricades, and hidden German soldiers made every step deadly. Artillery bombardment could destroy buildings, but also trap civilians and soldiers alike. Soviet commanders weighed speed against minimizing their own losses. They aimed to encircle the city, cut off German escape routes, and push street by street into the heart of Berlin. Supply lines were critical. Germans struggled to deliver food, ammunition, and medical aid to the front lines. Soviet supply trains ensured that tanks and artillery remained fueled. Engineers built makeshift bridges and cleared rubble to allow tanks to move. Logistics, not just fighting, would determine the outcome of the battle. The human cost was already mounting. Civilians scavenged what they could from destroyed buildings. Some joined local militias to help defend the city, while others tried to escape. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. The city smelled of smoke, blood, and decay. Nighttime offered little relief. Fires burned across blocks, and explosions could be heard in the distance. By mid-April, Berlin was a city on the edge of collapse. The Soviet army was ready to strike. German soldiers and civilians prepared for the worst. Every decision, every movement, every act of resistance or survival would shape the coming days. The stage was complete. Berlin's streets, buildings, and people were caught between two massive forces. The clash of strategy, leadership, and sheer human endurance was about to unfold. The coming battle would decide not only the fate of the city, but also the final days of the Third Reich. The Battle of Berlin can be understood from many angles. One of the most immediate is the human cost. Civilians were trapped in a city that had become a battlefield. Families huddled in basements or underground stations, listening to the constant roar of artillery and the distant rumble of tanks. Hunger, thirst, and fear were constant companions. Medical care was scarce. Hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilians, many suffering from burns, gunshot wounds, or collapsed buildings. Children were exposed to violence and chaos, often without adults to protect them. For those who tried to flee, streets were crowded with refugees, abandoned vehicles, and debris. Every step outside could mean death. The The tactical decisions of both sides also shaped the battle. German commanders, under Weidling's supervision, tried to turn streets, schools, and apartment buildings into defensive strongpoints. Snipers were positioned in high windows, machine guns in stairwells, and barricades blocked major avenues. Tanks were used sparingly due to fuel shortages, and soldiers relied on handheld weapons. The Soviet forces, aware of the dangers of urban combat, advanced methodically. Engineers cleared rubble to allow tanks to move. Artillery targeted German positions while infantry followed behind, clearing buildings floor by floor. The approach was careful but relentless. Weapons and technology played a decisive role. Soviet forces brought thousands of tanks, including the T-34, which was effective even in city streets. Artillery bombarded entire city blocks, while aircraft dropped bombs on strategic locations. Germans had some Tiger and Panther tanks, but many were immobile or out of fuel. Urban warfare meant that conventional strategies were less effective. Soldiers often fought at close range. Buildings became traps. Stairwells, basements, and rooftops all offered positions for ambushes. Explosives, grenades, and small arms were as important as tanks and artillery. The human perspective of soldiers cannot be overlooked. Soviet troops had endured years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. They were experienced, disciplined, and often motivated by revenge for the destruction and atrocities committed by the Nazis in the Soviet Union. German soldiers were a mix of veterans, teenagers, and older men. Many were demoralized but determined to follow orders. Fear, exhaustion, and the collapse of command made their situation desperate. Both sides faced high casualties, and every street corner presented the risk of death. Civilian experiences were equally tragic. Women and children were particularly vulnerable. The chaos of bombardments, street fighting, and occupation created situations where survival often required hiding, running, or surrendering to occupying forces. Many civilians were caught between the retreating German army and the advancing Soviets, often unable to find safety. Stories of survival often involved luck as much as skill or courage. The battle also highlighted leadership and command decisions. Zhukov and Konev coordinated massive troop movements to encircle the city and prevent German escape. Orders were precise, and supply chains were carefully maintained to ensure continuous pressure on defenders. On the German side, Weidling tried to organize defenses while Hitler issued unrealistic commands. The tension between strategic reality and Hitler's obsession with holding Berlin created confusion. Local commanders often had to improvise, choosing between obeying orders and protecting civilians or their soldiers. Every decision, from positioning a sniper to directing a tank battalion, influenced the outcome. Every street, building, and intersection mattered. The battle was not just about military strength, but about endurance, adaptability, and the ability to survive under extreme conditions. The moral consequences of the battle were already apparent. Civilian suffering was immense. Buildings were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the population faced starvation. Both sides had to make difficult decisions, balancing military objectives against human cost. For the Soviets, rapid victory was critical. For the Germans, stubborn resistance came at enormous human cost. The consequences would echo long after the guns fell silent. Berlin was no longer a city. It had become a maze of rubble, fear, and conflict. Soldiers and civilians alike were trapped in a fight that combined strategy, desperation, and raw survival. The coming days would test humanity and endurance in ways few could imagine. Another key perspective is leadership and decision-making. Hitler, still in his bunker, refused to consider surrender. He demanded that every street, every building, be defended to the last man. Orders were often impossible to follow, given the lack of soldiers, ammunition, and food. Generals such as Weidling and other high-ranking officers tried to implement realistic defense plans. They understood that the city could not be held forever. Tension between Hitler's commands and military reality created confusion among German forces. Soviet leaders, Zhukov and Konev, coordinated massive forces with precision. They balanced rapid advancement with careful planning to reduce their own losses. The enemy perspective shows the desperation of German soldiers and civilians. Soldiers were often young teenagers or older men, poorly trained and ill-equipped. They hid in cellars, basements, and ruined buildings, trying to delay the Soviets. Civilians were terrified, some joining the militia or helping in small ways, while others simply tried to survive. Food, water, and medicine were scarce. Every day was a struggle to stay alive. Many civilians had already lost family members in bombings or previous battles, and now faced the horror of close combat in their own streets. Moral and strategic consequences were profound. Soviet forces were driven by the goal of ending the war and punishing Germany for earlier atrocities. This created situations where brutal actions occurred, leaving lasting scars on the civilian population. German commanders faced impossible choices: obey Hitler's commands or protect their people. Many soldiers, particularly the young and inexperienced, were caught in the middle. Urban warfare magnified the consequences of every decision. Civilians, caught between retreating German forces and advancing Soviets, often suffered most. Technology continued to shape the battle. Tanks moved through rubble-strewn streets, artillery fired from a distance, and aircraft dropped bombs to break defensive positions. But in narrow alleys, close-quarter fighting neutralized much of this advantage. Soldiers often engaged in hand-to-hand combat in basements or stairwells. Snipers, machine guns, and grenades became the primary tools of combat. Buildings that were once homes or offices turned into deadly fortresses. Every movement required careful calculation. The human suffering cannot be overstated. Women, children, and the elderly were vulnerable. Families were trapped in buildings that could collapse from shelling. Some tried to flee west, only to find roads blocked by tanks, debris, or other refugees. Starvation and disease added to the danger. Civilians often relied on small acts of kindness, sheltering in basements with strangers, sharing what little food was available. But luck was as important as skill. Those who survived often did so by hiding quietly, moving carefully, or escaping unnoticed. Leadership decisions also shaped the strategic outcome. The Soviets aimed to encircle Berlin, preventing German escape and forcing rapid collapse. They used combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers. German commanders tried to slow them, using barricades and fortified positions. Hitler's insistence on total defense created heroic resistance in some places, but also led to unnecessary casualties. Local German commanders had to make life-and-death decisions for soldiers and civilians, sometimes disobeying orders to prevent total destruction. The psychological angle is significant. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. Civilians experienced constant fear, unsure if they would survive the next hour. The destruction of their city, the death of neighbors, and the collapse of society created lasting trauma. Even after the fighting ended, survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives amid ruins and loss. Urban combat transformed Berlin into a maze of fear and destruction. Streets, once full of life, became dangerous corridors. Buildings were traps. Ruins were everywhere. Soldiers had to fight floor by floor, room by room. Civilians had to hide or risk death. Every day was filled with noise, explosions, and terror. The city itself became a battlefield, and every corner carried danger. Finally, the moral perspective is stark. The battle showed the consequences of rigid leadership, total war, and human desperation. Every choice had a cost. The German insistence on defending the city to the last man brought death to soldiers and civilians alike. The Soviet desire for rapid victory ensured a relentless, often brutal assault. Both sides were shaped by the larger context of the war, and the people of Berlin bore the heaviest burden. Berlin was a city on the edge of annihilation. Soldiers and civilians alike were caught in a fight determined by leadership, technology, and circumstance. Every street, building, and basement told a story of survival, fear, and the cost of war. The coming days would push all of them to the limits of human endurance, as the city faced its final collapse. April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. Berlin shivered under the rumble of Soviet artillery. From the north and south, Soviet troops prepared their final assault. Zhukov's first Belarusian front approached from the east, while Konyev's first Ukrainian front advanced from the south. Both armies had encircled the city. Roads were clogged with rubble, abandoned vehicles, and fleeing civilians. The city's outer districts were already under heavy attack. German defenders tried to hold the line. Weidling coordinated the resistance, using every available soldier. Machine guns were mounted in windows. Panzerfausts waited behind barricades. Snipers aimed from high floors. Hitler Youth, barely 16, were armed with rifles, desperate to defend their city. Despite their courage, they were no match for the sheer numbers of the Red Army. At 0500 hours, the Soviets began the bombardment. Artillery shells fell on streets and buildings, shaking the ground and breaking windows miles away. Explosions sent plumes of smoke into the sky. Tanks rumbled forward through the debris, crushing barricades and debris. Infantry followed, clearing buildings floor by floor. German defenders fired back, but ammunition was low. Many streets were already filled with rubble, slowing movement. By mid-morning, Soviet forces had broken through the outer districts. Prenzlauer Berg and Friedrichshain became zones of intense fighting. Tanks moved carefully, supported by engineers clearing mines and rubble. Every building had to be checked. Basements were used as hideouts for soldiers and civilians. Stairwells became kill zones. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and shouting filled the city. The psychological pressure on German defenders was immense. Soldiers were exhausted. Civilians screamed as bombs destroyed homes. Families hid in basements, unsure whether to flee or stay. Some soldiers refused orders, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation. Others fought desperately, trying to slow the Soviet advance and protect those around them. Soviet leaders pressed forward. Zhukov and Konyev coordinated artillery, tanks, and infantry with precision. Engineers marked dangerous buildings, cleared paths for tanks, and used flamethrowers to remove resistance from fortified positions. Air support bombed strategic locations, crushing German strongpoints. Yet urban combat was slow. Every street required hours of careful clearing. Soviet soldiers were trained for this, but casualties were high. By late afternoon, fighting reached the Tiergarten area near the city center. Buildings that had survived the bombing were now battle zones. Streets were littered with rubble, burned vehicles, and debris from collapsed homes. Civilians emerged cautiously, scavenging what food they could find. Many were caught in the crossfire. Soldiers on both sides pushed forward, driven by orders, survival, or fear. Communication within the German command became nearly impossible. Radio lines were cut. Messengers risked death moving through the streets. Orders from Hitler were often unrealistic, demanding heroic defense in places where troops were already overwhelmed. Weidling tried to maintain coordination, moving reserves where possible, but the scale of the Soviet assault made control almost impossible. The first Soviet tanks entered the central districts by evening. Streets like Unter den Linden were filled with rubble, fires, and bodies. Infantry cleared buildings while tanks provided cover. Machine gun fire erupted from windows and doorways. Civilians were trapped in basements, stairwells, and cellars, their screams echoing through the ruins. The city was becoming a war zone in the truest sense. Even as the Red Army advanced, some German units launched desperate counterattacks. Small groups of soldiers tried to slow Soviet progress using explosives or ambushes. These attacks caused temporary confusion but could not stop the larger advance. The balance of power was clear, the city was falling. As night approached, the city was illuminated by fires and explosions. Smoke hung thick in the air. Soldiers and civilians alike were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. The stage was set for the final struggle in the city's heart. Every street, every building, every intersection would now decide the fate of Berlin. The fall of the outer districts marked the beginning of the endgame. Soviet forces controlled key access points. German defenses were fragmented, and the civilian population faced the full horror of urban warfare. The decisive moments were coming, and the collapse of Berlin's last defenses was imminent. April 21, 1945. The Soviet assault reached the very heart of Berlin. The government district, including the Reich Chancellery, became the main battlefield. Tanks rumbled along shattered streets, crushing barricades and rubble. Infantry followed closely, checking every building for resistance. Artillery continued to pound German positions. Smoke from burning structures mixed with dust and ash, creating a gray haze over the city. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler remained in his bunker. He was isolated from the reality above. Radio reports told of Soviet tanks approaching from multiple directions. Officers pleaded for evacuation or surrender, but Hitler refused. He ordered continued resistance, insisting that the city must not fall. Weidling, commanding the Berlin garrison, struggled to maintain organization. Many German units had lost contact with headquarters. Soldiers were scattered, exhausted, and low on ammunition. By midday, the Red Army had penetrated key central districts, including the Tiergarten, Brandenburg Gate area, and Potsdamer Platz. Street fighting was intense. Every building became a defensive stronghold. Soldiers cleared rooms, basements, and stairwells. Mines and booby traps slowed advances. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, hiding wherever possible, some fleeing into cellars or abandoned tunnels. The city was a labyrinth of rubble and death. Soviet engineers played a critical role. They cleared paths through destroyed streets for tanks and supply vehicles. Flamethrowers and demolition charges were used to remove fortified German positions. Infantry moved cautiously behind tanks, clearing buildings room by room. The coordination between artillery, tanks, and infantry ensured constant pressure on defenders. Meanwhile, German soldiers mounted desperate counterattacks. Small groups tried to push back Soviet advances using grenades, machine guns, and explosives. Some succeeded temporarily, reclaiming streets or buildings, but they were quickly overwhelmed. German morale was collapsing. Exhaustion, fear, and the futility of resistance weighed heavily. Civilians witnessed the destruction and death around them. By evening, Soviet forces controlled most of the city center. Key government buildings were surrounded or occupied. Fires burned across blocks, and smoke filled the air. Civilians who had tried to flee found streets blocked by tanks, artillery, or rubble. Families huddled in basements, fearing the next bombardment or street-to-street fight. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, medical services, had nearly collapsed. In Hitler's bunker, the situation grew desperate. He received reports of Soviet troops reaching the Tiergarten and the Brandenburg Gate. The German command structure was fragmented. Many officers disobeyed orders to preserve life, realizing the city was lost. Soldiers had no reserves, no reinforcements, and limited supplies. Survival, not victory, became the priority for both civilians and defenders. The human cost intensified. Women and children were exposed to gunfire and shelling. Thousands were trapped in collapsed buildings or basements with little food or water. Soldiers faced street-to-street combat in impossible conditions. Snipers, machine gun nests, and booby traps made every movement deadly. Smoke and fire created disorientation. Exhaustion, fear, and hunger compounded the horrors of battle. By late night, the Soviets had nearly surrounded the Reich Chancellery. Fighting continued in every building nearby. Tanks provided cover for infantry moving through streets littered with debris. Each step forward was met with resistance, yet German forces were being steadily crushed. Civilians continued to hide, some trying to sneak past fighting to escape. The collapse of Berlin was no longer a possibility. It was happening in real time. The final hours of battle in central Berlin were chaotic. Soldiers, civilians, and tanks moved through the same narrow streets. Explosions shook the city. Fires consumed homes. The combination of artillery, tanks, and infantry created a relentless storm. The Red Army was methodical, experienced, and overwhelming in number. German defenders, despite bravery, were too few and too exhausted to stop them. By April 22nd, the outcome was clear. The city's defenses were fragmented, most streets controlled by Soviet forces. Hitler remained in his bunker, isolated and defiant. Civilians faced unimaginable conditions. Soldiers struggled to survive, fighting house to house. Berlin, once the heart of the Third Reich, was now a city under siege, teetering on the edge of total collapse. Every action, every decision, every movement contributed to the turning point of the war in Europe. The fall of Berlin was no longer a question of if, but how quickly and at what cost. The city had become a theater of destruction, human suffering, and final resistance, a defining moment of World War II. By late April 1945, Berlin lay in ruins. The city that had once been a bustling center of culture, politics, and life was now a battlefield of shattered buildings, burned streets, and twisted metal. Fires continued to smolder across blocks. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with ash and the scent of death. Streets were blocked by rubble, destroyed vehicles, and remnants of barricades. The sound of distant artillery had mostly faded, replaced by groans, cries, and the clatter of debris. The human cost was immense. Estimates suggest that in the final battle for Berlin, tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed. Soviet casualties were also high, though exact numbers remain debated. Civilians suffered the greatest toll. Thousands were killed in bombardments, crossfire, or collapsing buildings. Many were wounded, some permanently. Families were torn apart. Children, who had hidden in basements or fled with relatives, were left orphaned. Survivors wandered through streets strewn with corpses, searching for food, water, and shelter. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers and civilians alike faced shock, grief, and fear. German soldiers, many of them teenagers or elderly men, struggled to comprehend the collapse of their city and the regime they had served. Civilians confronted the horror of urban warfare firsthand. The screams of the dying, the destruction of homes, and the sudden disappearance of friends and family. Trauma would linger long after the guns fell silent. Physical destruction was nearly total in central Berlin. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened by artillery, tanks, and bombs. Historical landmarks, government buildings, cultural centers, and monuments were heavily damaged or destroyed. Streets were littered with debris and bodies. Infrastructure, including electricity, water, and transportation systems, was crippled. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded and sick, struggling to provide care with minimal supplies. Survivors described scenes of chaos. Some hid in cellars for days, emerging only when streets were empty. Others tried to salvage food or find relatives amid the destruction. Military units had scattered, leaving civilians to navigate a city in collapse. Firefighters, police, and civil authorities were either dead, missing, or unable to respond. Looting occurred in some areas, not always out of malice but from sheer desperation. The boundaries between soldier, civilian, and victim blurred. Official reports documented the scale of destruction. Soviet officers reported the capture of strategic buildings, streets cleared of German defenders, and thousands of prisoners taken. German authorities, where they remained, compiled casualty figures, though many were incomplete due to the chaos. Contemporary photographs show ruined buildings, streets filled with rubble, and civilians huddled in basements. Eyewitness accounts describe the despair, confusion, and exhaustion of those who survived. The city was now under Soviet control. Troops moved through streets carefully, securing key buildings and preventing pockets of resistance. Red Army soldiers faced the challenge of managing a city with millions of terrified civilians. Some civilians greeted them with relief, hoping for food or safety. Others fled, afraid of reprisals or violence. The presence of occupying troops marked a new reality. Berlin was no longer under German control. Urban infrastructure posed additional problems. Bridges, railways, and streets were damaged, making transport of food, water, and medical supplies difficult. Hospitals were short on medicine. Fires continued to burn in isolated areas. Water and electricity were largely unavailable. Civil life had collapsed. The city that had been the capital of Nazi Germany was now a broken landscape of survival. The scale of destruction was a testimony to the intensity of the battle. Soviet strategy, combined with German resistance, created conditions in which almost no area of the city was untouched. Streets that had once been lively markets or thoroughfares were now filled with rubble, craters, and abandoned weapons. Buildings that had survived bombings were gutted by artillery or close-quarters fighting. Every corner of Berlin bore marks of the battle, a visual record of the final struggle of the Third Reich. Civilians and soldiers faced the reality of survival. Food was scarce. Many depended on humanitarian aid from Red Army units, if available. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and makeshift shelters became necessary. Psychological trauma compounded physical suffering. Witnesses later recalled the smell of smoke and decay, the constant presence of death, and the uncertainty of what the next day would bring. The aftermath of Berlin's fall also marked a significant military and strategic shift. With the city captured, Germany's resistance in the east collapsed. Soviet forces could redirect efforts toward the rest of Germany. The Western Allies, advancing from the west, would meet little organized resistance. Berlin's destruction was not only a military victory, but also a psychological one. The capital of the Third Reich had fallen, signaling the imminent end of the war in Europe. The human suffering in Berlin did not end with the cessation of fighting. Thousands of civilians remained trapped among rubble and burned buildings. Families searched desperately for loved ones. Many were homeless, wandering streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Food and clean water were scarce. Hospitals struggled to care for the wounded, lacking medicine and basic supplies. Disease spread quickly in crowded shelters, adding another layer of danger. Psychological trauma was widespread. Soldiers and civilians alike had witnessed unimaginable violence. Children had seen their parents killed or injured. Women had endured assaults and terror. Survivors described feelings of shock, numbness, and fear that lingered for months or years. The scale of suffering created long-term scars, both physical and emotional. For many, life after the battle required rebuilding not only homes, but also trust and a sense of safety. The city itself was devastated. Central Berlin had been reduced to ruins. Government buildings, cultural landmarks, and residential blocks were destroyed or severely damaged. Streets were filled with rubble, wrecked vehicles, and debris from collapsed structures. Bridges, railways, and roads were heavily damaged, preventing transportation and further complicating relief efforts. Utilities like water, electricity, and gas were largely inoperative, leaving survivors to improvise for basic needs. Historical records from both Soviet and German sources describe the sheer scale of the destruction. Soviet reports noted the capture of key buildings, thousands of prisoners, and the clearing of German defensive positions. German reports, often incomplete, recorded casualties among soldiers and civilians. Contemporary photographs show the aftermath, streets lined with rubble, burned-out vehicles, and devastated neighborhoods. Survivors' testimonies recount the terror, exhaustion, and despair of navigating a city that had been torn apart in days of intense combat. The fall of Berlin marked a strategic shift in the war. With the capital captured, organized German resistance in the east effectively ended. Soviet forces could redirect troops and resources to other areas, while the Western Allies advanced largely unopposed from the west. Berlin's destruction and occupation by the Soviets symbolized the final collapse of the Third Reich. The war in Europe was nearing its conclusion, but the cost had been enormous. Civilians faced an uncertain future. Many tried to salvage belongings from destroyed homes or abandoned buildings. Relief efforts were limited. Red Army troops provided some assistance, but supplies were scarce, and the scale of need was immense. Hunger, exposure, and disease were constant threats. Psychological recovery would take years. Survivors had to rebuild their lives amid ruins, trauma, and the loss of family and friends. The social impact was profound. Families were broken apart, communities destroyed, and social order disrupted. Many children were orphaned, and adults faced the burden of caring for the vulnerable amid extreme scarcity. Institutions like schools, hospitals, and local governments were non-functional or severely limited. The collapse of infrastructure and governance left civilians to fend for themselves in a city dominated by the immediate need for survival. Strategically, the capture of Berlin shifted the balance of power in Europe. The Soviet Union gained control of the eastern part of the country and positioned itself for post-war influence. Western allies focused on occupation zones and reconstruction, while the Germans faced unconditional surrender. Berlin's fall was not only a military victory, but also a turning point that shaped the post-war order in Europe. The psychological weight of Berlin's fall extended far beyond the city. Soldiers and civilians across Germany realized the war was over. Many surrendered or fled, seeking safety in areas occupied by Western allies. The shock of losing the capital, combined with the visible destruction, brought the reality of defeat home. The human cost, tens of thousands dead, millions displaced, was a sobering reminder of the consequences of total war. By May 1945, Berlin was a city of ruins. Its streets and buildings were destroyed. Its people were traumatized. Yet the story of survival, human endurance, and the cost of leadership decisions remained etched into every corner. The aftermath of Berlin was not only a historical event, but a human story, showing both the horrors of war and the resilience of those who survived. The fall of Berlin set the stage for the end of World War II in Europe. Germany's surrender followed soon after, but the scars of battle, destruction, and human suffering remained. The city would be rebuilt, but memories of April 1945, the human cost, and the destruction of the Third Reich lingered for decades. The fall of Berlin in April 1945 marked the end of a dark chapter in human history. The city, once the heart of the Third Reich, lay in ruins. Streets were destroyed, buildings reduced to rubble, and thousands of lives lost. Soldiers and civilians alike had endured unimaginable suffering. The human cost of the battle was staggering, and the psychological scars remained long after the guns fell silent. Berlin's destruction also revealed the limits of power and leadership. Hitler's refusal to surrender, his insistence on total defense, and the rigid orders issued from his bunker led to unnecessary death and destruction. On the other hand, Soviet commanders, determined to end the war quickly, advanced methodically and relentlessly, demonstrating both the efficiency and brutality of modern warfare. Leadership decisions, whether strategic or ideological, directly shaped the experiences of millions caught in the battle. The battle showed the immense consequences of urban warfare. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft could destroy buildings, but soldiers and civilians bore the brunt of close-quarter combat. Every street, every building, every basement became a stage of struggle. The cost of defending or attacking a city was measured in lives, both military and civilian. Berlin became a symbol of the destructive potential of war and the resilience of those who survived. Yet amid the destruction, the city and its people would endure. Berlin would eventually be rebuilt, and life would slowly return. The story of the battle serves as a reminder of the human consequences of war, the importance of leadership decisions, and the resilience of communities in the face of unimaginable hardship. History does not forget the price paid, and the lessons of Berlin remain etched in memory, evidence of both the horrors and the enduring strength of humanity. The fall of Berlin was more than a military victory or defeat. It was a human story of courage, suffering, and survival. It marked the collapse of the Third Reich, the reshaping of Europe, and the beginning of a world attempting to rebuild from the ruins of war. The city's scars tell a story of the past, reminding us of the cost of conflict and the enduring need for peace. If this journey through Berlin's final days moved you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep, historically accurate World War II stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment of Berlin's fall struck you the most? Every story of history has lessons, and your perspective matters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary that brings history to life in a cinematic, easy-to-understand way.